Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we'll do a DIY hand painted pots and planters. We'll be doing a tutorial for two planters today. They are basically inspired from the Jaipur Blue pottery. The shades I have chosen are basically blue. So without further ado, let's get started into the tutorial. First up, let's check what all are the supplies that we require for this DIY. You will need a planter. A white shade planter will be really well. If you do not have, don't worry, you can paint one as white. Secondly, you would need shades of blue, acrylic paints or fabric paints. Next, brushes, and then a permanent marker. So the first planter that we'll be trying out is the chevron motif one. So for that, you have seen the pattern already in the planter. So what we'll be doing is to just make an outline with a permanent marker first, so that it's easier for us to trace the patterns with the paint. As you can see, I'm just drawing only the main outlines that I require for equal spacing of my pattern. Once the lines were clearly marked, I started with the paint, but then I realized that I made a mistake by starting the coloring first. So instead, I should have started by defining the outlines first, so that it was easier to fill in the spaces later. So I go ahead with a thin brush, which is a round brush size 0. I dip it into the paint and I'm just defining the outlines very slowly and with a firm hand. So make sure that your pot is primed first. As I said, if you do not have a white planter, no need to worry. You can as well take a black or a terracotta planter and then prepare the surface by painting it white with a chalk paint or gesso or any kind of white paint that you have. So the planter that I'm using is the one that I brought from Amazon, and it has a white glossy surface. It's actually a plastic pot, so whenever you're painting on a plastic or a glossy surface, make sure that you prep the surface by sanding it with a sandpaper. Since I do not have sandpaper right now in hand, and during lockdown there's no other way than to just work with whatever supplies I have, I'm just skipping the sanding part and going straight ahead with painting. But you have to be really careful while you paint on a surface that has not been prepared, because there is every chance that the paint chips or peels out after it dries. Once I finished the bands, then I started defining the triangles. So if you're not sure if you can paint the lines straight, then a suggestion would be to cut out a triangle in a piece of paper and then keep it right at the spacing, and then keep drawing the outline. Once the outlines of the triangles were done, I started filling in the areas with the same blue shade. So one another thing that you can make sure while you're painting is to clean your brushes in between, because when you are continuously painting, there's every chance that the amount of paint that you dip into, it gets clogged onto the brush surface, and also over time it dries up, and then your bristles won't be as smoothly working as it was before. So make sure that you clean your brush in between whenever you feel that there is just too much of paint that is getting stuck on the brush. Secondly, whenever you're painting, also make sure that do not dip the brush directly into the bottle of the paint, but instead take the paint into a smaller cap or a palette and then take the paint from there, so that your brush does not hold too much of paint. It's totally up to you which one you want to paint first. either you can go with the bottom half first and go to the first half, or it's totally up to your convenience. So once I finished painting, this is how it looked. I felt the middle portion was a little blank and there was too much space which was staring at me. So I thought initially that I'll fill it up with dots, but they didn't look that beautiful to me. So instead I settled for another band or a line to fill in the balance space. So this is how it looked after the first coat, and I left it to dry for 24 hours. That is, I did the second coat on the next day. As you can see, the brush strokes are more defined and you can see that there are gaps and white patches everywhere. So you can go in for a second coat, and the second coat need not be as in depth as the first coat. If you feel that there are gaps, you can just fill in the gaps or define only the lines. So I'm just fast forwarding the second coat clips, but I would just like to show how nice it looks with the second coat. You can see that the lines are even more defined and the colors are popping out so much more once you give this. Another thing to remember when you're giving the second coat is that do not apply too much pressure over the first coat of your paint, because you have not prepped the surface, or at least I haven't prepped my surface. There is every chance that when you're pushing the paint with too much pressure with your brush, the first layer can peel out. So make sure that you're not putting so much pressure when you're painting the second layer. Once the second layer was completed, again I left it for 24 hours to dry out. Once it was completely dry, I sealed the entire surface with a varnish that I had, aqua wood finish one from Asian Paints. Let's move on to the next DIY hand painted pot, which is the gradient one. So again, you would need a white planter, and then you would require all the shades of blues that you have. So what I have done is that I have chosen 4 to 5 shades of blue acrylic and fabric paints from my stash, and then painted bands starting from the darkest shade at the bottom and going on to the lowest or the most lightest shade to the top. So I have started with the lightest shade. I'm using a flat brush here because there's too much area to cover, unlike the previous pot where you have to define more lines. So with the help of a flat brush, I painted the lightest blue first. When you're using the same brush without washing, it makes sure that there is a mixing of shades so that there is no stark contrast between the two adjacent colors. Going in with a third shade, which is a bit more darker. As you can see, again I am painting the bands one after the other. There obviously is going to be brush marks there that can be covered in the second layer that will be going to, so do not work so much into removing the brush strokes. It's going to go off in the second layer. Now after the second and the third colors, I'm choosing the fourth color, which is a bit more darker, and then going in with the next band. I'm sorry that the video is actually skewed and chopping off a part of the planter, but I was just so engrossed in painting that I kind of did not see that I was going out of focus. Now going on with the third shade, which is the last shade. I finished that also, and then I kept it for drying for 24 hours before going into the second layer. Now all the shades do not look very different because some of the shades are almost of the same tone, but we'll make that up in the second layer by mixing the shades. So when I did the second layer, what I did was I mixed a bit of a darker shade for the first shade and made it a bit more on the darker side because the sky blue was just too pale for the entire set of blues. Similarly, when I went for the second shade, I mixed a bit of the lighter shade to bring in more gradient. And wherever I felt there has to be a little more darker or lighter shade, I accordingly mixed the shades. Once again, let it dry for 24 hours and then use our Aquador liquid varnish and then seal the entire surface so that that stickiness that is generally there with the acrylic paints, it goes off. So this is the final DIY look of the planter. I hope you all liked it. So see you next time. Until then, bye bye.